This is Joe with joesastrophoto.com, and today we're going to be taking a look at Nina, the nighttime imaging and astronomy acquisition software. Before we get started, for this video I'm assuming that you have all your drivers set up for all your equipment. Let me know in the comments if you want a video on setting up the ASCOM platform and all the drivers. The problem, of course, is that not everyone is going to have the same equipment as I do, but it may help you to see how things get set up in case you're stuck. But for now, let's dive into Nina. You'll need to download it and run the setup from the Nina website, but it's a pretty easy process. You need to choose between the 64-bit and 32-bit operating system. Once it's installed, you could double-click the icon on your desktop, and it'll ask you to load a profile. I have mine set as default, but you can have multiple profiles, and I'll show you where to customize those later in this video. Let me maximize the screen. Now on the left side of the screen you have your main tabs, and underneath those you'll have sub-menus. So let's start with equipment on the top, because you need to connect all of your equipment before I could show you the other stuff. So under camera, you can choose which camera you want to connect to. I have two cameras, but the 120 mini is my guiding camera, so of course I don't want to connect that. So we want to go with the ASI 1600 Pro, which is already selected, and we simply connect it. Over here is your cooler power, and if you click here you could start cooling the chip sensor. I have my target temperature set to minus 15 degrees Celsius. I think the biggest thing to look at here is to make sure that your pixel size is correct, because that's what the plate solver will use, and to make sure that the gain that's set here and your offset are what you want them to be. You can change them here as well as the USB limit, and I usually use 139 as my default gain while doing LRGB imaging, and I usually use 200 when doing narrowband imaging. So now let's move to the filter wheel, and we'll just connect that as well. And you'll see that the filter names are imported in. I'll show you where to do this later in the video. You can also change the filter right here if you'd like to. Let's just change it to luminance. And let's change to luminance. And we'll connect the focuser next. And in here you want to see that the position is where you set it. The target position is where it should be, and the position is where it's actually at. So if you see this is different, you may want to run the autofocus sequence. Now let's connect the telescope. Connecting the telescope takes a minute, and what will happen is that the EQ mod for your telescope will come up. This is part of the ASCOM platform. You'll notice that it's flashing parked, and you'll notice that you've got the same northwest, east, south keys as you do here, and you could also unpark it here. I would like to point out while this is up that, let me move this, that the sight latitude and longitude should match as closely as possible to the sight latitude and longitude here. If these don't match, you're going to have some issues while trying to do unassisted meridian flips. But for now, let's minimize this and move on. If we try and connect the guider without PhD2 loaded, it will usually give us an error. And here's the error. Because PhD2 was not connected at the time. Oddly enough, Nina will launch PhD2 for you and then connect. Let's minimize this for now, as we'll go over PhD2 guiding in another video. So that's all I have connected here. The camera, the filter wheel, the focuser, the telescope, and the guider. And actually, the guider doesn't show connected. There we go. So we're going to jump around a little bit. We're next going to go down here to options. So under the first tab in options is general. Here's where you have the profiles I was talking about earlier, and how you could have multiple profiles and customize them. I'm just running the default profile. However, if you don't like the dark blue like I do, you can change it and pick whatever colors you like throughout here. There is one important thing on here besides the profiles, and that is your latitude and longitude. Here is where you need to enter those numbers I was talking about earlier to match what you have in the EQ mod for your telescope. The reason that you see all the 4s on this one and all the 3s on this one is because whenever I would try and get any more granular than 4 digits past the decimal point, the meridian flip would flake out on me. So when I just put it to 4 digits, then Nina automatically inserted the 4s in the latitude and the 3s in the longitude. I'm not sure why, but it does work, so I've pretty much just left it alone. So your next tab will be your equipment tab. There's a lot of information on this tab. Let's start up here with the camera. You can actually go in and change this, but you don't want to. This is usually pre-populated for you, and unless it's wrong, you don't want to change it. My camera, for instance, the ASI 1600, has a pixel size of 3.8, and while it's not a true 16-bit camera, that's the way it presents itself, so you should leave it at 16-bit. I did have to put in my telescope name and my focal length and focal ratio. It's important that you add the focal length and focal ratio after you've subtracted the flattener reducer. So by default, my telescope has a focal length of 559 millimeters, but after attaching the flattener to it, it reduces it by 0.8. It also reduces the focal ratio as well. You need to set these and make sure that they're correct in order for the plate solving to work correctly, that I'll cover later in the video. The other important thing here is that you want the no sync off. If you turn this on by accident or on purpose, your telescope will not sync after the plate solve automatically. Next is the focuser. I've got my autofocus initial offset steps to 4 and my step size to 20. I honestly can't remember what the default was, but through trial and error I found that 20 is the optimal focus step size while doing autofocusing for me. I don't have any kind of weather modules, so I usually leave these turned off. I keep Fahrenheit temperatures off. The autofocuser does have a temperature sensor, and I do use it. However, everything is in Celsius, so I just kept that in Celsius as well. Over on the filter wheel side over here, you'll want to import your filters from the filter wheel the first time. Then you'll get the names that you set up in your ASCOM drivers. I just use the initials because it's pretty simple, LRGBSHO. In the offset, the focus offset, you could put the number here that you get from the autofocuser. And what that'll do is that when you change from, say, luminance to red in your sequence, it will move to this new focus offset for you without having to do an autofocus. It takes such a small amount of time to do the autofocus, and because the temperature is never quite the same, I usually just do an autofocus in between. So you don't really need these, but it's helpful just in case for some reason the autofocus doesn't work, whatnot. And then the autofocus exposure time is what the autofocus uses for the particular filters. So for LRGB, I've got it set for 5-second exposures, but SHO, since they're narrowband filters and less light will come into the camera, I've got those set for 10 seconds as opposed to 5. Now we'll move on to the imaging tab. Here you'll have the file settings. I prefer FITS because it works with just about all software that I've ever found. So it's much easier to work in, so I keep it as FITS. That is also the default. Under the imaging file path, it's set to the root directory here of what you want it to be. I set mine to the directory called Nina. Right here, you need to add the target name from the path down here. It's pretty simple. If you click in here, and you'll see the cursors flashing, and then you click on the target name right here, you'll add this in. This is not here by default, and it's very important that you add that. What I found is that without it, you just get the image type. And if you're going to do multiple targets in one night in the same image file path, that the new targets will overwrite the old ones. So by putting the target name first, it will save it in the subdirectory under Nina, and then your target name, say M31, and then when you move on later in the evening to say M33, it will change the target name to M33, and all of your files will be in a different subfolder. But without it, you will actually overwrite your old files. So it's very important to put in this string after or before the rest of this. The other one that I added also is gain. And the reason that I like gain in here in my file name is because when I use darks, I have a whole dark library, and sometimes I'll have multiple folders and I'll forget what gain that I was using so that I could match it up with my dark library. Now we'll move on to the auto meridian flip. It's disabled by default, so here is where you would turn it on. This can become very complex, and you need to observe it the first few times that you try it out. I think I'll make a whole new video on this because it's that complex. So for now, if you're just starting out, I would really leave this to off and manually do your meridian flip. In the future, I'll have a video on it that can help out. You'll need to know what kind of mount you're using and how it interacts with the meridian. Sometimes, depending on where your target is, your camera could hit the tripod legs or the pier, and you want to make sure that doesn't happen. So it takes a little trial and error to figure these settings out. On image options, this is just the image that you see on Nina. This isn't what your actual images look like. So these don't affect the actual images that you're taking. It's only the way that Nina's displaying the image that you're taking to you so that you see what you get an idea of what your images look like. And so you want to set the auto stretch factor to 0.3. I've tried a lot, and that seems to be the best for displaying, at least on my monitor. And here's where you want to set up your folders where you want to save your sequences, so that when you're doing a multi-night project, you don't have to remember what you had in there the night before. You could save it as a template and then load it in the sequence screen. I've got my mount set to park when the sequence ends, and for my camera cooler to shut off. Well, let's move on to the plate solving tab. In here is where you can tell Nina what plate solver to use. I prefer Plate Solve 2. It seems to work pretty quickly, so that's what I choose to use. And under the plate solver settings is where you could tell Nina where the plate solver application is on your computer. Over here you've got the exposure time and what filter. Because I use the luminance filter, I only have it set to 10 seconds. If you were going to use a narrow band filter, I would probably set the exposure time to at least 30 seconds. I've got it set to a gain of 139, and I've got my tolerances set to within 1 arc minute or 1 degree. Okay, let's move on to the Sky Atlas. So when I first saw this, I was very intimidated and I didn't know how to use it. But this is a fantastic way to set your slew target, to get framing assistance, and to get information about targets that are hard to find without going to other websites while you're in the middle of trying to image. So here you put in the object name. It wants to use Andromeda, so let's do that. And type in what you want your target to be, the Andromeda Galaxy, and it'll let you know that it's M31 Andromeda, the NGC, which is pretty cool. And it'll give you your right ascension, declination. But what I like about it is that you can see when your meridian flip's going to occur. So if you're not sure, or you've been having issues with your outer meridian flip, you know that if you wake up about 11:30, you can go outside and see what's going on with your telescope and why it's, what happens if it works or doesn't work. So that's a really nice feature right here. So if we set this as the sequence target, it will send this over to the sequencer, and it'll plug it in. So you have M31, and that's just going to be your sequence. You'll also still see this, and we'll go back to the Sky Atlas, and we'll also set it for a framing assistant. Now this takes a minute because it's loading the NASA Sky Survey, but what it's going to show you is a picture of the Andromeda Galaxy, but more importantly, it's going to show you where in your frame the Andromeda Galaxy is going to be. And it'll give you the opportunity to recenter the image in your frame and then replace that as the sequence target. And once you do, your right ascension and declination coordinates will change, and you'll plate solve to those new coordinates, and the sequencer will point to those new coordinates. So that's pretty powerful. Okay, I fast forwarded a little bit as it was taking a really long time to load the image, but here's the NASA Sky Survey image of the Andromeda Galaxy, and this is how it would fit on my sensor. So you can see you're not going to get the full galaxy based on the way it is. If I had a rotator in my image train, I would be able to rotate this so that it came up to here, and I could catch this as a diagonal image. However, I don't, and you're not always going to be set up this way anyway. You won't know until you take your first picture how you are. But basically you could see that this almost fits, and when you take your first image, it might not be in this orientation. And after the meridian flip, it will be completely mirrored. So let's go back to M31. This is pretty easy. What we want to do now is say how long we want each exposure to be. And for luminance red, green, and blue, I usually shoot 90 seconds. And we're going to want about, let's start with 100 luminance. And we're going to want to turn dithering on. And we want to dither every 3 frames for 100 exposures. And now we'll just hit the plus key down here, and we'll change the filter to red. And we don't need 100 red. I think 60 red will be just fine. And we'll dither every 2 frames on that. And now we could just hit plus a couple more times and just change our filters to green and blue. And because I'm doing this video in the middle of the afternoon, it's going to be 12:54 p.m. and it's going to take 7 hours to do this sequence, so it won't be done until 10:43. So if we start about 7 o'clock and we run until this is going to run for almost 8 hours, that would pretty much do the night, so we wouldn't have time to move on. But let's just say that we had more time. We can pick this target, and it would have been a target. Let's go back to the Sky Atlas and put a different target in. Let's say M33. Oops, that's M33, the Triangulum Galaxy, and we're going to set this as our sequence target, just for something to put in here so you can see. Now on this one, I would check the start guiding on, because when this one ends, the guiding will stop. And so we're going to say to slew the target, because you'll still be looking at Andromeda at the end of this one. When this one starts, it'll slew to the target. And you'll also want to center on target. This will basically do a plate solve for you by centering on the target. And we're going to do the same thing because it's Galaxy, and we're going to do it in LRGB. So we could set this to L. Dithering on. Frames. Let's, just for simplicity, we'll say 50. And at 50, we'd probably dither every 2 or maybe even every 1 frame. And then just add the rest. R, G, and B. And just, I would never probably run this sequence, but this is just to show you 20 seconds. And we would dither every 1. Okay. And the finish time, you see it says for this target. So it's going to start after the other one is completed. And if we come back here and look, this one for this target is at 10:45. So this will start at 10:45, and it'll end, the duration of it is 3 hours. So this is your total finish time. So it starts here to this point. So what I do is I'll look to see what time the astronomical twilight starts, or ends rather, in the morning. and I'll see that I try and shoot for 30 minutes, maybe even an hour before that for the final time, because this doesn't, I don't believe anyway, that this takes into account the time it takes to do the meridian flips. And if both targets have a meridian flip, you're looking anywhere from 5 to 10 minutes extra for those. So you're already at 20 minutes. And sometimes a cloud will come by and it'll pause your PhD2 guiding. And if that's the case, then Nina will actually wait until it reacquires the target before it moves on. So there's some things that could affect these times. This is just an approximate time, so you don't want to cut it too close. I've done that in the past, and it's 7 a.m. and the sun's out, and it's still trying to take the last remaining blues or something, and it kind of messes up my target. Okay, let's move on to the imaging tab. I'm going to quickly cover the tabs I have open down here below. The first one would be autofocusing, and this is where you would start your autofocus, and it'll take so many shots, and then it'll converge into a V, and it'll tell you what position gets the best focusing for the filter. The filter wheel is just basically where you would change the filter. So I could change from luminance to red. Then I can come back to autofocus, and I could run the autofocus for that filter if I needed to. And I would get the position when it's completed. And I can come over to options and equipment and come over to the focus offset and add it here if I'd like to. Let's move on to imaging tab. This is where you would take a single shot to see where you're at, or you can move into live view. I have the exposure time at the moment set to 40, which is kind of high for luminance. I'd usually have this at 10. What happened was I probably had a narrow band filter in here, and then I had 40 seconds. So you could just change this to something like 10 and start the exposure. Again, I'm shooting this in the middle of the afternoon, so I can't really shoot to anything. The gain here, I usually leave that at just 139 for any of the filters, just because this just gives you an idea of where you're at or if you're close. It's not absolutely needed. The focuser tab, again, is like back under the equipment, where here's your position, here's your target position. So the image tab would show you a picture of the image. And the plate solving tab is pretty straightforward. Once you've got your target set up in the Sky Atlas, you move and you slew to the target, you can come here and click capture image and plate solve. These settings are the same as in the equipment, but if you change one of these settings, then it'll override what you had under options under plate solving. So when you're done plate solving, you could also come to the image tab, and as the plate solver takes images, they'll appear here. This tab always shows the latest image that's been taken. The camera tab I just have up there to make sure that I've got the correct gain and the correct temperature. If I don't see that this is correct, then I'll stop everything and make sure that it is. The telescope is just here to make sure that the meridian flip, it'll tell you how long before the meridian flip for the target that you have. So that's really nice. And then the guider graph, while you're guiding, you just want to make sure that your RA and deck stay within +1 and -1. And that's it. We've covered everything.
Thanks for watching. I hope you found some of those settings useful and informative. Please let me know if you have any questions in the comments below. And remember to subscribe for more astrophotography videos.